Finally, The Chosen Season 5 is here in theaters. Not just the premiere that which we saw previously, but now I can actually talk about it because you guys have all seen these episodes, or if you haven't, you're just really interested in seeing what is in these. Now, it goes without saying, massive spoiler alert. These are our overviews. In our overviews, we are going to talk about every single scene that is in these episodes, starting with episode 1 right here. We're going to go from the very beginning to the very end, talk about things that I found interesting, and we're going to talk about all of it in pretty good detail here. I have a lot of notes. I think I have got like something like 25 pages of notes or something. There's a lot that is going on in these episodes, and a lot of it I loved. I have some issues with some of it, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So if this is not the video for you, please click off. But if you're ready, let's dive into The Chosen Season 5, The Last Supper, Part 1, Episode 1. Definitely not a mouthful at all, huh? All right, let's jump into this. Let's talk about this first. Part 1 of The Chosen has a 99% score on Rotten Tomatoes. This is a great kind of community score here. We haven't had an official critics score of the show quite yet for Part 1, but I'm sure that we'll get one for every single part as we go through. And other good news here, we see that the first weekend here has pulled in just about $11 million. You can see this purple highlighted section here. So that's great. That pays for not even 2 of the episodes, but I'm sure that we'll get there, right? Over all of season 4, they grossed around $30 million. So we're hoping to obviously do much better than that. And the numbers so far are leaning much better than they were for season 4. So we're looking at some really, really cool stuff kind of happening for season 5 overall, and how big of a jump we're getting in terms of revenue and everybody coming to see this show, which is very, very cool. Obviously, people are getting acclimatized to going to the theater and all that stuff. So let's start from right at the beginning of episode 1. Before we get into episode 1, there's actually like a 10 commandments of The Chosen, which is a funny little thing to tell you how to behave in the theater. So that was quite interesting. Then Dallas does a little bit of an introduction, talking about what the season is going to be about and giving you, a little bit of a push there. He also gives us a QR code at the beginning of the theater, the beginning of the episodes, basically giving us access to not only a scene which is has its commentary on it. This is of Jesus cleansing the temple. And then also we get a new scene from, I believe, episode 3. And so quite interesting. We get some extra little content there. Of course, we'll talk about those things in another video. But this one in particular, let's start with episode 1. All right, here we go. From the very top, both of these episodes actually start with the Last Supper. Now, a lot of people were kind of confused by this, but I think it's a great choice to kind of show us where we're going and then kind of meet in the middle whenever we go throughout the season. Now, if you didn't notice in this, we actually start at the end of the Last Supper. Now, we start around here in John chapter 17. Technically, we're in John chapter 16, so I'll go back there. We start here in this section here, and Jesus kind of puts it, does a couple of these different sections, but it's almost word for word throughout this entire section of scripture here. First of all, he starts off with this section here where he talks about your sorrow being turned into joy. Now, if you're a big fan of my channel, you've already seen us talk about a portion of this scene previously, but we see a lot of this spoken about here. I'll read some of it for you. A little while and you'll see me no longer. And again, a little while and you will see me. So some of his disciples said to one another, what is this that he says to us? A little while you will not see me. And again, a little while you will see me. And because I'm going to the Father. So they were saying, what does he mean by a little while? We do not know what he's talking about. Jesus knew that when they asked him, so he said to them, is this what you're asking yourselves? What I mean by saying a little while and you not see me, and again a little while you will see me. Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament. The world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. So we see a lot of this section here, including when a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come, but she has delivered the baby. She no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. So we get a lot of this section here in John chapter 16. We also get some of this section here where he talks about overcoming the world. I have said these things to you in figures of speech. The hour is coming when I no longer speak to you in figures of speech, but will tell you plainly. about the Father. In that day you will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I will ask the Father on your behalf. For the Father himself loves you because you have loved me, and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and have come into the world, and now I'm leaving the world and going to the Father. His disciples said, now you are speaking plainly. And in the show, this is actually Matthew. And Matthew says, thank you. And then Jesus says, for what? And Matthew says, you spoke plainly. Like, we don't have to question these things. I think Nathaniel speaks up as well here. And you see this play out. So you're not using figure of speech. Now we know that you know all things and do not need anyone to question you. This is why we believe that you came from God. Jesus answered them, do you now believe? Behold, the hour is coming. Indeed, it has come when you'll be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. So right in between these two sentences, we get a big outcry from all the apostles. We're not going to leave you alone. We're not going to, don't worry, like we'll never leave you, blah, 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 right? They're all kind of talking over each other. Then Jesus interrupts and later comes back to, yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so we see this kind of section happening here. In between that, he also asks Andrew to sing a hymn to kind of end the night. Remember, we're starting at the end of the Last Supper. This is the last portion of the Last Supper. And so right as Andrew kind of ends the dinner, you can see in this whole portion, by the way, Judas is not here. Clearly, he's already left by this point in John, and in this point in the Last Supper. And then we get to John 17, and right as Andrew starts singing, remember, we've already talked about this scene on the channel. You can actually see me sing the exact song that Andrew sang here. So if you want to go find that on the channel, you can do that. But this is the high priestly prayer, which is what Jesus goes into once Andrew starts singing. He kind of focuses on himself. The singing kind of dies down in the mix, the audio mix. And then we hear as Jesus begins going into the high priestly prayer. This is a pretty interesting section here because this is one of the most famous prayers of all time in John chapter 17. We don't get too much of it. I wonder if we'll get more later in the season, but he does say about this much that I have highlighted here. Again, this is while they're singing here. Jesus is speaking this. Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all flesh, to give eternal life to all whom you have given him. And this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you have given me to do. And so that's what we kind of see there. And then it doesn't really continue throughout the rest of this section. Now, this is a pretty long chapter here. But there's a lot of really amazing stuff within this chapter that I love here. So definitely go check out John chapter 17 for sure. And that's kind of where the section there ends. And then we go into the intro of the episode. So right after that, we get a couple of things. We see a bunch of people kind of walking around getting ready for the triumphal entry, just as we left off for season 4. So we kind of come back from this flash forward and go back to where we left off right at the end of season 4. And then we see one character in particular, Shmuel, as he is kind of walking about the city, and he gets to the gates of Caiaphas's compound. Now, Caiaphas's palace is a large building that is massive in Jerusalem there. We can actually go to that location today, that what we believe is Caiaphas's palace, and you can actually go to a place where Jesus was kept in a dungeon, which is crazy to think about. But here we see Shmuel go in, he washes his hands, and then Caiaphas doesn't really say anything to him. He just kind of walks in and he says, it's everything I feared. And so he's obviously talking about his time talking with Jesus in the house of Lazarus and everything that kind of comes with that. He was obviously disillusioned with who Jesus was and totally rejects him at this point, saying that it's everything that he feared that it would be. He was hoping it would be better, but it's everything that he feared. Then we move on to the triumphal entry scene. Now, we have seen a lot of this moment. I've already talked about this just a few weeks ago. We had this triumphal entry scene where they all come in, and then they're kind of interrupted by the Pharisees and Yusuf, who comes out, and Gadara. It's Zebediah, Gadara, and Yusuf who all come out and basically stop them from the triumphal entry. And then they have a discussion saying, like, you have to stop this in order to save your life. You need to turn back. And Yusuf is like, hey, I'm not with these guys, but they're kind of right. Like, like you're kind of stirring up some stuff, you know, you got to be careful. So we get that scene there. And Jesus says, they say, stop your disciples from, you know, worshiping this and like, you know, calling this out. And he's like, if I tell them to shut up, even the rocks are going to cry out, right? And so they continue on and they continue doing the triumphal entry. And at the end of this scene, there's a moment where Yusuf contemplates, should he follow them or should he go with the other leaders in the law? And so Gadara and Zebediah decide they can't follow them in because it'll look like they're followers of Jesus. But Yusuf is kind of wrestles with that a little bit. Tamar even kind of holds out her hand and welcomes him to come with the group. And he decides not to because he wants to keep it a secret how he feels, right? If he was totally open about how he felt, he would be kicked out of the Sanhedrin. He would be in dire straits, right? That's why the Bible tells us he was a secret follower of Jesus. And so that's going to continue. Oh, by the way, I'm talking about him like he's in the Bible because I am 1000% sure that he's Joseph of Arimathea. In fact, I have confirmation of that now from some different things that I've done. So Yusuf, that we've had since season 1, is 1000% Joseph of Arimathea. So that's how we're going to look at him from now on. He's in scripture in that way. So that's what we see there. Now, as they go into the city, right after Yusuf decides to go with the other leaders of the law, they begin walking into the city and we see that everything starts to build up and build up. Now, here's the first contentious moment of season 1, okay? I've heard a lot of things, a lot of comments on this on both sides. As they begin to go into the triumphal entry, we see Jesus on the donkey, everybody's shouting and hollering, and it's a great time. And right then, as they're singing, Hosanna to the Son of David, we hear this electric guitar come in and just really hard pound it. And then we get a drum and bass beat that kind of comes in as well. It's almost like a Rocky type of song that is the background to this. This was the first thing that I think a lot of people either loved or really did not like. For me personally, it's not a huge preference of mine. Like I was really looking forward to this moment being like, like super epic and reverent and like it kind of took me out of The Chosen a little bit. Similarly to the Feeding of the 5,000 music, if you remember back during season 3's finale, it was the same thing for me where it was like that heavy rock music. It takes me out of The Chosen. Like The Chosen should feel historical. It should feel like, you know, like it's actually happening right then. And it just took me out of it a little bit. But I know a lot of people absolutely loved the music for sure. And so they're going into the sheep gate, into Jerusalem there, and we see this rock music kind of coming in. Now, in between this section, there's like this big fanfare that's happening, and then the music starts to kind of die down a little bit, and Jesus starts to tunnel vision onto the walls of the temple. Now, one thing that they did really great, I believe this is in the set of Utah, clearly, where they filmed this, but the bricks that are here, the stones that are here are actually Herodian stones. I love that little detail. Herodian stones have kind of an outline on the outer edge, like a border on these solid stones. That's how Herod kind of identified the stones that he put into place on the temple area, which you can still see today. And so Jesus kind of focuses on one of those stones, and you see blood begin to kind of drip down from the stones, and he's like tunnel visioning on it. All the music is kind of dying out. You see Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene as they like look worried as he's like not really moving. He's kind of looking distraught. And then they kind of snap him out of it, and he goes back to the triumphal entry and begins walking in again on the donkey as he's kind of saying hi to everybody and you know, kind of going through there into the temple, clearly. Now here, as he's going through the sheep gate and we see all this kind of stuff happening, we get the perspective of a lot of different people. Number one, we see Atticus. We also see the Watcher during this whole section. Now, the Watcher is someone who we've guessed about for like a year now of who he is and kind of what's going on with him. I am like 99% sure it's supposed to be Luke now. We've seen Luke once before. If you remember the Christmas special, The Messengers, at the end of that, the very last like minute of it, we see Mary walking into a doorway as a young servant opens the door, and then we see Luke there. An older version of Luke. This would be something like how long would it be? I think it would be something like 25 years or something like that after Christ's ascension. So he's quite older, obviously, so he looks much different, and obviously it's not the same actor. So my guess is that this is going to be Luke. Everything kind of points to it, including the fact that he's not really Jewish, and that he, like, scholars kind of think of Luke as like almost like a Hellenized Jew. So like he doesn't really follow a lot of the Jewish customs, and we'll talk about that later because there's some hints to that as well. Not as much in this episode, but in episode 2. So we'll talk about that as we get there. Next, we actually get into the temple area. Jesus gets off his donkey and begins kind of walking around. He's heading to go and preach a little bit as he gets into the area here. And this is where we get some of our first dialogue with the apostles. And Peter says that he's wanting to learn how to preach, okay? Which is quite interesting. He's never really preached before other than the 2x2s. And so Andrew is kind of like excited for him. He's like, yeah, sure. Like, yeah, go and do that. And Peter wants to be a fisher of men. He wants to learn how to preach, and he wants to get better at it, essentially. Now, during this section, we notice a couple of different things in the dialogue. One is that Thomas is still very much emo. Thomas is still very much distraught and really struggling with the whole raising of Lazarus thing and losing Rama and all of that. It's been really hard for him, of course. And he says this line here. He says, some are waiting here with open arms and some with daggers. And so he's worried about this whole situation. He's like, Peter, if you're going to preach, like, be careful, essentially. Like, he's really worried about everything that's going to happen. And he's definitely still in that emo phase that we've seen him in before. Now, after Thomas actually says this, Peter's like, yeah, maybe you're kind of right. And he asks Zebedee to take all the women. Well, the women that he's in charge of. So he asks him to take Eden and then Lazarus' sisters, since they don't have anybody to kind of like protect them. He asked them to take those 3 into the court of women in order to protect them and to keep them safe. I think maybe he says Mother Mary as well, because she's not in the scene after this, I don't think. So yeah, those women he takes to the court of women, and he basically protects them over there. Now here we see another scene with the Watcher as he's kind of looking above into the temple area, and we see him watch Yusuf as Yusuf goes and he buys some clothing, and then he changes out of his Pharisaical clothing and changes into normal people clothing so that he can go and watch Jesus, which is quite interesting. We actually see him in the crowd, wearing his similar garb to what we've seen him before as he was hiding as a citizen. Back in season 2, episode 7. And so we see similar clothes to those as he's kind of coming out and watching Jesus, just in the crowd there. Hey, real quick, I hope you're enjoying these videos. We put a lot of work into making these videos the best that we possibly can for you guys. If you want to help to support our channel and support what we do here on The Chosen Sleuth, then the best way to do that is through snipesupport.com. This is our Patreon where you can donate $5, $10, or $25 a month in order to help us to continue to make videos just like this, to have the time to spend hours and hours and hours and hours doing research and putting these videos together. Anyway, let's get back to the video. Thank you guys so much for your support. Now here we jump over to Pilate and Atticus, which is really, I love a lot of the scenes that are happening here with the Romans and even with some of the Jewish leaders and stuff. But obviously Pilate and Atticus are always a fun duo to kind of watch. It's kind of like Obi-Wan talking to a mentee that doesn't really want to listen to him, right? A Padawan that doesn't really want to listen to him. And so we see this relationship kind of starting out really jovial and fun. And so we see this happening in Pilate's quarters, which we're seeing this big set for, and we see out the windows, you can see this massive, it's actually like I don't think it's painted, but it's probably like a printed background that has all of Israel on it, all of Jerusalem on it. It looks really great on camera. I think it's really well done. I was worried that it would look kind of fake, but I think it looks really, really good. I don't think many people would notice overall. But they're talking about basically Jesus's entrance into the city and what this looks like, and some particular things that I found interesting. Pilate says, did you see his grubby little followers? Not a soldier in the lot. So he's saying, I'm not worried about them. They're not an army, right? And Atticus says, oh, well, they said the same thing about the Maccabees, right? And so Pilate is kind of like, yeah, it is what it is. I don't see any soldiers here though. Right after this, a huge platter is kind of shown that has all the things that Jewish people hate on it, which is hilarious that Pilate would do this. And of course, it's something that he would do, I'm sure, to just make them mad. But he's got shrimp and oysters and a bunch of different shellfish. And then he also has pork on there, which of course are all illegal foods. You cannot, by law, have these foods, right? And so Pilate has all of these foods. Why does he have those foods? We're going to talk about it in a second. As he's kind of eating, as Atticus always does, the servants bring in a big kind of chest. It's like a big, I don't know how to explain it. It's like a big wardrobe, essentially. And they kind of place it down. And Atticus, as this happens, he turns around and he says, "Oh, happy Caiaphas Day." Because this is for Caiaphas. We're going to talk about why that is in a second. So here we kind of see as like this unlikely friendship has to take place between Pilate and Caiaphas. They kind of need each other. Pilate needs Caiaphas to control the population, and Caiaphas needs Pilate in order for Rome not to squash them and just destroy them as a people, right? So what did Pilate bring in this wardrobe? Well, it is the high priestly garments, the vestments. And so these are obviously very special clothing that the high priest wears at certain times during the year in order to do his duties as the high priest, in order to do the sacrifices, in order to go into the Holy of Holies, for example. And so this garb that he has is extremely, extremely important. Now, why doesn't Caiaphas have it by himself? Why doesn't he just own it and have it in his closet or have it near him where he can grab it whenever? Well, because Rome controls all of Israel, they decide what to do with religious freedom and religious vestments and things like this. So Rome controls them throughout the entire year, except for these 3 portions where they allow the Jews to use them. Okay, so this is what Atticus means when he says "Happy Caiaphas Day." He brings in those vestments, and it's a funny scene here as Caiaphas kind of enters. Atticus is leaving. And Atticus actually takes an oyster on the way out and he slurps it in Caiaphas's face. A little small portion here that I kind of skipped over is Claudia as well. Claudia is Pilate's wife. She kind of comes out for a moment. She says, "Oh, I hate the smell of this," talking about shellfish and stuff. And he's like, "Well, we have braised pork as well." And she's like, "I'm not hungry." And she goes back to bed. And Pilate and Atticus have a funny little moment where he's like, "She's fine, shut up." And Atticus is like, sure, yeah. We know that she's kind of struggling. I think we're going to see more of her dreams this season for sure. Season 6 obviously is the culmination of that, where she asks Pilate not to do anything with Jesus because that's scriptural. That's actually the only time we really see her in scripture, but we're building up to that moment there. So I'm sure we'll get more of that this season as well. So here we see that Caiaphas comes in, they have a little back and forth. They talk about the vestments. They talk about needing each other. They talk about how much money is going to be made from the trading of different currencies and different things like that, the money exchanging, as well as the temple tax. There's a lot of money being made. And this Passover in particular, there's about twice as many travelers as there had been in previous years. So Pilate says, well, we should expect double the income, right? It's just simple math. And so Caiaphas explains that their coffers are already overflowing. There's a lot of money to go around. And so Pilate is going to be happy about that for sure. Now, as we continue, he actually goes and opens the wardrobe with the vestments in it, and he's about to grab it with his hand. Caiaphas screams. He's like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. And so they talk about how if he touched them, they would be unclean for 7 days. And of course, that would go past the Passover. It would ruin everything for the high priest not being able to do his job because he needs these vestments in order to do those jobs. And so then Pilate pulls out like a pole with a hook on the end and kind of unhooks the vestments and then gives them to the servant of Caiaphas as they kind of go through the episode. We see a little bit of back and forth. And at the end of it, Pilate says, we're going to be friends someday. And as they walk out there. Now, one of the key lines that is said within this scene here is this one. Now, originally, when I talked about the Watcher, one of my biggest theories was that he was going to be the thief on the cross. This obviously is not the case because of this one line here. Pilate says, we have 3 executions scheduled for Friday, including one zealot murderer. So make sure that all your people are there or are in attendance. Pilate wants all of the religious leaders to be there at the execution, which we know is the execution of Jesus, but not quite yet, right? And he wants them all there in order to kind of show his control, to kind of show that he is in line with the religious leaders. Okay. Now this does end up being the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay. On Friday, we have those 3 criminals that are going to be executed, and one of them is a zealot murderer. Well, who is the zealot murderer? This would be Barabbas. Most people believe that Barabbas was connected to the zealots in some way. Some scholars kind of have this idea. And so that is kind of what they're doing in The Chosen. They're having him be a zealot murderer. Now, is this a zealot that we've met before? I don't know. It might be. It might be one of the zealots that we've seen in previous seasons, maybe one of the ones that were after Simon the Zealot, or that we've seen earlier on in season 2. Who knows? We're going to have to see when it gets closer. But as for now, we do know that those executions are already scheduled. So the thief on the cross, the one that was on the other side, and then the 2 thieves basically, and then Barabbas in the middle are already scheduled to be executed for Friday. So those are already on the books, ready to go. So it's a really interesting section there. Anyway, Caiaphas leaves the office, and then we go back to Jesus preaching here, which we can jump back into some scripture here. He basically starts off immediately in John chapter 12. So we jump over to here. We see him kind of start in verse 23, and he says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." And so we see that kind of going through there. Then there's a little bit of a break in the teaching here as they're kind of looking around the audience and showing different people that are in the audience, including Yusuf, obviously Mary Magdalene, all the apostles are there. There's a bunch of people surrounding him in the middle of the temple area in front of Solomon's portico. And so we see the continuation here. Right before he says this line here in verse 27, he kind of grabs his chest. It's almost like he's having a heart attack. Like he kind of like bends over and he grabs his chest, and he's like in a lot of pain. Jonathan is, or Jesus is here. And he says, "Now my soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour?" And he's under his breath, he actually adds, "No, no. But for this purpose I have come, this hour. Father, glorify your name." Now here is a really interesting part in the theaters, because I've seen this twice in theaters now, right? And so I've had different experiences both times and different audio balances both times. But here is where they've added a lot of spirituality, which we've never had before. We've never had an angel kind of appear in the show, other than the Christmas specials, which is just like light, right? We didn't really see the angels. We've never had the voice of God. We've never had like the world of the supernatural encompass the world of the chosen, right? So this is the first time outside of miracles and things like that people are kind of reacting to, that we get a really supernatural moment, okay? "Then a voice came from heaven, 'I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again.' The crowd that stood there and heard it said that it thundered. Others said, 'An angel has spoken to him.'" And so we get the crowd's reactions as the thunder rolls. Right underneath the thunder, if you didn't hear it, there actually was a voice there that says, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." And you kind of hear it echoing amongst the thunder. Now, the first time that I saw this in the big theater during the premiere, nobody in our group other than me and David Tate actually heard the words. Brandon Robbins and his editor and my wife, Vanessa, all of them didn't even hear that the voice was actually there. They were like, "Oh, they must have just put thunder there." But there was actually a voice of God. I don't know who performed this voice. I'm sure that it's like an interesting thing to find out, although it doesn't really matter that much, right? I don't know who did the voice, if it was like an alteration of Jonathan's voice or if there was some other actor that did it. I don't know. I didn't recognize the voice. It was kind of a deep, thunderous voice. But it was really interesting. The first time, a lot of people in my group didn't even notice that the words were actually there. But then the second time that I watched it, it for sure was way more evident. So just depending on how your theater's audio is kind of like EQ'd, I guess, it'll be more apparent or less apparent depending on where you are. But I thought that was a really, really cool moment. I mean, I'm super excited to see more of that in The Chosen for sure. Yeah, really, really great. And then we see it continues here, and he says, the voice has come for your sake, not mine. This is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up off from the earth, and right here during this line, again, most people would say this is talking about his crucifixion, right here, when I am lifted up from the earth. This line, it kind of goes towards Mary Magdalene, and she's kind of understanding what he says more than everybody else. And she's kind of like, huh? Like, oh no, she's not like excited about that. When I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And so he said this to show what kind of death he was going to die, which is, of course, crucifixion, when he says he's being lifted up. So the crowd answered him, we have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. We didn't get all of this in the show. We get this section, though. The light is among you for a little while. And during this whole section, we're hearing like little murmurings of people like talking about the different voices. We even see Jesse and Veronica that are here. And Jesse didn't really hear anything in the thunder, but Veronica thinks that she did. And then the other apostles are like, depends on who they are. Like Thomas didn't really hear anything, but for sure, like John and Mary Magdalene did. But Big James was kind of like, it kind of sounded like a voice. And we'll talk about that in a second. And so, yeah. But the voice was definitely there for sure. I've seen it multiple times now. It definitely was there, which is really, it's just a cool moment. I love that moment. But Jesus says, the light is among you for a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. The one who walks in darkness does not know where he is going. While you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become sons of the light. Now, this again is a huge kind of hyperlink in the book of John. Okay, so we're in John chapter 12. This is a huge hyperlink. Whenever Jesus talks about the light, when he talks about daytime, for example, he is talking about while he is here on earth. Okay, so the light is among you. He's talking about himself. Okay, for a little while longer, because he's about to die here. While you have the light, or while you have me, lest walk while you have me, lest the darkness overtake you. In other words, like, see what I'm doing now, understand what I'm doing now, accept that I'm the Christ, accept that I'm the Messiah while I'm here, because I'm about to die. I'm about to go away, and things are going to get a lot different around here. And so that's kind of what he's saying here as he goes through. So cool though. I love that section here. Really great stuff. When Jesus said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. So right after he's done saying this section, there's another kind of big hit of thunder that hits there the second time. And he goes, yeah, that one was just thunder. Let's all get indoors because it's about to rain. Okay. So there's two thunders. The first one had God's voice in it. The second one was just thunder. And he says like, hey, it's like, let's go inside. Let's not get rained on. And then he goes away and he hides himself, just like we see there in scripture. Now, right after this, we see a couple people having different conversations. John and Mary are having a conversation here, and they begin to talk about like what Jesus is going through. What is he talking about here? And John is kind of questioning. He's questioning, like, is he being serious about this? Is he being poetic about this? He said to die, but die in what sense? And he's kind of concerned about this. We're going to see this repeat throughout the season, that John and Mary specifically have more and more of these conversations. And so we're going to see that kind of take place over these episodes, but also I think further on into the season as we go. Now, after they leave the temple area, they meet in a small alleyway real quick with everybody in the group, and they have a quick meeting to kind of talk about some different things. Now, I didn't mention it because I was going to talk about it here, but earlier on during the Jesus preaching portion, Joanna actually comes up to Tamar, and she says, hey, I have this house if you guys want to stay here. It's my friend Phoebe's place, but she doesn't like being here during the festivals, and she said that you guys could stay there. Okay. Now, Phoebe, while it's not really mentioned in the show, is a scriptural character. Okay. This is Phoebe from the New Testament that we know later on is a Christian and someone who helped the early church. Okay. Paul talks about her, I believe. I can't remember what book exactly. I'll put it on screen if I can remember. But she is a biblical character, but she's not going to be in this season at all. She's not going to be in The Chosen at all, I don't think. She may show up in Acts at some point. I don't know. We'll have to see several years from now. But Phoebe is a biblical character. We got confirmation of this from the kind kind of set designer and historical expert that is on the back end of the Chosen. He was on the Brosen podcast and actually talked about this exact thing there. So we've gotten confirmation that it is the biblical Phoebe, but she doesn't show up in this season really at all. And so we see that there. But they have a quick meeting here outside of the temple where Jesus talks about how Joanna has given them a place to stay, and so they're going to stay there. And he tells them a specific mission to do while they're going throughout the city. He says, preach while you go throughout the city. You can use any of the teachings that I've done in the past, and like go ahead and just talk to anybody that you can about what's going on and who I am, and you know, preach the good news essentially. And so Peter is all like hyped up about this. He's ready to go out and preach, but he wants Matthew to go with him. And so he pulls aside Matthew. He gives Andrew all their stuff to go back to the house, and Matthew is going to go help him preach somehow. And so we see Peter as he leaves to go do that. And then Jesus leaves off on his own, and he says, I'll be at the house soon. And everybody kind of says soon with him, of course. Now we get the scene where we get the group from Teldor comes into the city. Now we've talked about this one as well. We've done a whole video on this scene in particular, so I won't stay too long on it. Basically, we see the Watcher as he encounters Kophni's group, as Kophni is screaming out part of the scripture with the rest of the group. He says, the Lord tests the righteous, and dumps coals on the wicked, basically. And so we see them talking about this, repeating this specific verse as they walk into the city. They're kind of declaring that they're there. The Watcher kind of stops them and is like, hey, what group are you with? Who are you guys? And he begins talking about what's going on here. Now, like I said, I'm 99% sure that this is Luke, but I don't know why he would be talking to Kophni here. Like, it's a little bit weird, right? It's a little bit weird that Luke is here in general, and I'm sure we'll talk about that much more during the deep dives and stuff. But him kind of intercepting Kophni doesn't really make sense to me. Like, what is his role here? If Luke is a doctor and he's like writing down things and all that kind of stuff, like it seems a little bit weird to me. I don't know. So maybe he's not Luke. That's the 1% of me that's like, okay, whatever. I don't know what's going on there, but we'll figure out in this season, we've been told. So we'll continue to think about it and see what's going on. But they have this conversation, and then Kophni kind of continues on into the city after being interrupted by this guy, and he begins to, basically go after Jesus in a lot of different ways. Then we see as the rest of the group arrives to Phoebe's place. So they go towards Phoebe's place, and they're all excited to be here because it's super nice. Phoebe is obviously extremely wealthy. She's got basically a palace that has, a ton of different guest rooms and a bunch of different places for people to sleep. And Joanna has had the place ritually cleaned, she said earlier. So they all come in, they drop off their bags, and everybody's super excited. Nathaniel in particular says, this is going to be the nicest Passover I've ever had. And then the rest of them are kind of like a mixture of excited, but also kind of like worried about what's happening in this whole situation in Jerusalem. They're kind of worried about the religious leaders as well as the Romans and how they're going to be perceived. Are people going to think that Christ is coming to like overthrow everybody? Are they going to try to attack us? That sort of stuff. So Simon the Zealot in particular is kind of thinking strategically about that and thinking through it, while a lot of the rest of them are just kind of like laying on their beds and excited to be in a comfortable place because they're used to sleeping on the ground. But Thomas again comes in, he throws his bag on the ground like a teenager, and then he's emo again, right? So we get another moment of emo Thomas, and he says, they begin talking about what has happened so far in the triumphal entry, and then Jesus preaching, and they talk about the thunder in particular. Basically someone says like, I heard the voice in the thunder. Then Big James is like, yeah, it kind of sounded like it. And then Thomas comes in with this line. He says, when people want to believe something, they can certainly make the skies talk. And so he's kind of like questioning, right? He's beginning to doubt a lot here. And then Nathaniel follows it up with, do you want to believe? And then that's the end of the scene there. So we see them a little bit quarrelsome, a little bit excited to be in this nice house, but they begin talking to each other. Then we kind of transition into the next room, which is the women. They're kind of next door to the men in a different room. And Tamar is admiring all the super nice things that Phoebe has in her home. For example, she's got like imported silks. She's got like amazing stuff all around the room. And then in particular, she talks about this terra sigillata, which is essentially a piece of pottery. You can see examples of that here. So terra sigillata is pottery that's made in a very specific way to make it look very glossy on the outside. And then you have these images that are kind of carved into these different pieces of terra sigillata. Now, on these pieces, normally you're telling a story or referencing a specific god or goddess or different things like that. You'll see all throughout Phoebe's home, there is a lot of pagan imagery. They would be very uncomfortable with this, but the place is nice, so they're going to stay there, right? I'm not sure if this would actually be the case. I'm sure Jesus would be fine to, I don't know if he would either, to be honest with you. I don't know if Jesus would want to stay in a place like this, but realistically in history. But in the show, they seem to be fine with it. They're kind of tolerating it while being maybe a little bit uncomfortable. We see as Tamar looks at the terra sigillata and she's extremely interested in it as she has, Phoebe obviously has fine taste. And then she asks what is being shown on this as the artwork here. And then Joanna kind of talks about it, and she says that this is Heracles, which we know him as Hercules. Hercules is the Roman name, Heracles is the Greek name. And so she says Heracles defeating the king Laomedon of Troy. And so basically the story goes like the king hired Hercules to kill this monster, then Hercules kills the monster, and then the king doesn't pay him. So then Hercules gets people together and they kill the king. So that's kind of what's happening there on the pot there. Then Joanna goes into a little bit about her husband. She says, she's talking about how her husband is a fool, but he's not dangerous. And they talk a little bit about her husband there. And then Mary says fools can be dangerous and kind of offends her a little bit, I think. Of course, Joanna and her husband are now estranged. They're not divorced or anything yet. They're still husband and wife, but she's definitely left him at this point. And so we'll kind of see where that goes eventually. We don't really know quite yet, right? The next scene that we get as Mary leaves the room from this awkward conversation, Tamar and Joanna kind of look at each other. They're kind of she's obviously in a mood at the moment. She goes and she sits on a bench with John, and they look again up around Phoebe's sort of courtyard area. And there's a bunch of different pagan imagery all around, different mythological creatures and different things that are kind of all around. John looks up, and at a specific one, he talks about this specific kind of story that he's read before. And so Mary says this woman's home is filled with strange scenes. And John talks about how the scene in front of them is the ghost of I'm going to try really hard with this one. Clytemnestra. She's trying to wake the Furies. Now the Furies are a mythological creature that is like a human basically with wings and claws. And then the Furies' job, they're kind of not mortal, but they're not immortal either. They're kind of somewhere in between. And their job is to basically punish certain sins, certain type of things that happen, right? They're kind of vengeance for justice, if that makes sense. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the simplest way I can explain it here. So that's what he's talking about there as he's kind of looking at it. And Mary looks at him and she says, "You've read everything." And he says, "Don't tell my parents." They begin talking about mysteries too great to comprehend. And this kind of transitions them from talking about these big mythological creatures into talking about Jesus. And Mary says, or worse yet, mysteries, or worse, not mysteries at all, that are not mysteries at all. And so they begin talking about Jesus and how he seems to be saying that he's going to die, right? He seems to be saying that his life is going to come to an end, and he's actually serious about it. So John and Mary are really the only ones that are kind of picking up on this. And remember, scripture is pretty clear that they can't know. It's impossible for them to understand. In fact, I think it talks about this right here in John chapter 12, the unbelief of the people. When Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. Why did they not believe? so that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. So this is why they didn't believe. Lord, who has believed what he heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore, they could not believe. Okay. So this probably includes the apostles, right? Therefore, they could not believe. For Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and has hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart, and in turn, I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nonetheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for the fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. So even the people that understood, right, even the authorities that understood, they didn't confess it because they were afraid of the Pharisees. They were afraid of the authorities of man rather than the authority of God, right? And so they couldn't understand it here, okay? So that's a big portion here. We have to remember that. That's what John and Mary are struggling with, because it's not that it logically doesn't make sense. In fact, they don't know what to believe. They cannot believe it, right? And so Mary and John are kind of working their way through this, having a discussion about it. And they talk about certain things, like, for example, Jesus coming through the sheep gate. Why would he do that? The sheep gate is where the sheep come in to be slaughtered for the Passover. But Jesus chose that gate to come through on a donkey, right? It's a pretty intense thing, right? And John even asks, he says, is he making it this painfully obvious that people wouldn't think to put it together? And then Mary responds with, if he is, what do we do? And John responds with, I hate the feeling of powerlessness. And so that's where that scene kind of ends. They're putting it together, but they feel like there's nothing they can do to prevent it, which of course there isn't, right? Kaphne and his family, and then we kind of cut to them. It's nighttime now in Jerusalem. We see as Jesus is walking through the city, and he actually walks by Kaphne and his family, but of course they don't recognize him because he's got his hood up as he's kind of sneaking around the city. He doesn't really want to be bothered at this time. They begin talking about Herod and how they could maybe use Herod to kill Jesus. Maybe they could get Jesus on Herodias's bad side. They believe that Herodias was the one that had John the Baptist killed and that Herod didn't really want to do it. So that's kind of some of the rumors that are going around. And so they're talking about that there. They're talking about why Jesus doesn't criticize Rome and how he insults their own people more than he does their oppressors, which of course is a big point, right? He's talked way more about the religious leaders than he has about Rome. Why? Because he expects Rome to get things wrong. He expects the Gentiles to get things wrong because they don't have the book. They weren't the people of God, right? They had to be grafted in later. So at this point, he's not there for the people of Rome, right? He is, but he's not, right? While he's on earth, he's trying to correct and reprimand the religious leaders so that they can kind of turn around and do what they're supposed to do. But that doesn't really happen either, right? But he warns them and tells them exactly what they're doing wrong. And so that's a big section there. But we have this scene with Kaphne, and he's basically vowing to deal with Jesus. This is going to be the last week of Jesus' life, that he's going to figure out some way to get to Jesus. Now, of course, we know Kaphne is going to play a bigger role later. Kaphne, if you don't remember, is Rama's father, by the way. And so he's obviously going to play a big role later on, probably being the one that is shouting, crucify and crucify him, and helping people to chant that as he turns people away from Jesus in total. So we see that there. Now, after this, we begin to follow Jesus as he goes to the wedding scene. Now, this is something that we saw first at ChosenCon. So I've been talking about this. I think I've done 2 videos on this scene already. You can see my videos about that scene, but the gist of it is that Jesus goes to a wedding. He's just hanging out and having a fun time. He joins in the dancing, and his hood comes off. Then we see a child as the child shouts, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, right? Hosanna to the Son of David. And we see as Jesus, everybody looks at Jesus and they stop the wedding, essentially. And then he's like, yo, sorry. He's like, I got caught, you know? And then the wedding couple ask if he will bless them. And so then he prays over them, and then he leaves, and then they say, Happy Passover, and then they all leave there. And that is the end of that scene there. Now, from here, we see that Jesus goes again back to the temple. On the court of women, there's kind of a wall to the top of the holy section, the court of women there. And so we see him as he's looking over towards Solomon's portico and then into the court of women and kind of looking around in the area. And we get these flashes of all these things that the people are doing that are kind of desecrating this holy place. We see people drinking and having a party basically within the temple. We see the money changers as they're taking more money than they're required to and doing all these different things, right? Taxing people more than they should and all these different things and making it a horrible place, making it a den of thieves, like we're going to see later on, right? We've seen a lot of stuff behind the scenes with that as it's coming, right? But we see a few things that are quite interesting throughout this scene. One, we see a choir that is singing the same song that we see from season 4 during the Hanukkah episode, which is episode 6. We see them singing the same song that the apostles actually sang, one of them, the one that goes like this: "Who is like the Lord our God?" That one from season 4, episode 6. We see a whole choir singing that. Now, why is this important? This is definitely a connection to Little James. We know that Little James was going to be part of the 288 choir, which is in the temple in Jerusalem. So clearly this choir that we're seeing here is part of the 288 choir that was referenced all the way back in season 1, episode 6, I believe. And so we're obviously getting some more of that background that's going to come. We know from our behind the scenes research that Little James is going to have some moments of flashbacks in the season, as well as Thaddeus. And so I'm expecting those pretty soon, if not at the beginning of episode 3, probably within part 2 would be my guess here, to see that there. So we see that. We also see just the money changers, the drinking people, the laughing, the having fun. Like the temple is not, it's meant to be reverent, right? It's meant to be a holy place. And yet it's being treated as something that it's not. And so Jesus begins to get angry. He begins to kind of like really, get upset about what's going on. Now, as he does this, he turns around and he looks towards the court of women and towards the Holy of Holies. And the same thing happens that happened at the beginning of this episode. He looks back and he sees one of the Herodian bricks as it begins to bleed blood. And then not only does he see that, but then the whole place transforms as he begins to kind of talk through this section here. He actually goes basically to Luke chapter 19 and says this. He adds at the beginning of it, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem," because that's from another version, I think in Mark, ? No, not in Mark. Matthew, maybe. But he adds, "Oh, Jerusalem," at the beginning of it. But then he says, "For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone left upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." And so this is basically Jesus right before he's going to cleanse the temple in the book of Luke. But we see this section here as Jesus talks about this. While he's doing that explanation here, we see that it transforms us to a flash forward into 70 AD. Okay, this is what we saw in the trailer with a bunch of the Roman soldiers as they're not only burning the temple, but we see the stones falling over. We see these explosions. We see temple guard being stabbed and killed. We see citizens being basically stabbed and killed, like just gunned down in the streets, right? Not gunned, but spears and swords and all that kind of stuff. Now, the number one thing in this is what's really interesting, of course, is Dallas Jenkins himself. This is his first cameo within The Chosen. Now, I think most people would not recognize him at all. There's only a few moments where he actually looks towards the camera and you can see his face quite clearly. Only if you know going into part 1 will you recognize that it's Dallas Jenkins, but the center Roman with the big kind of head fan, the helmet fan, he is Dallas Jenkins. And so Dallas has been in every single project that he's ever done. He's made a cameo in every movie or short story or whatever. He's always made a cameo. And so this is his cameo in The Chosen, is him as a Roman soldier. Flash forward to 70 AD, and he does a great job. He kind of kicks either a temple guard or a Pharisee, I can't remember, but he kicks them off the stairs in front, and then he goes down and he stabs them with the other Roman soldiers, and we see the destruction of the temple here. Now, why is Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple, and how does this link to his triumphal entry and everything that's happening there? Well, in his triumphal entry, we see that Jesus actually weeps as he goes in. The reason for this is because the people around him do not understand why he's here. And in fact, in just a few days, all of the people that are here praising him will be the same people that deny him and choose to crucify him in just a few days, right? So that's where this sadness comes from. It's a connecting point of like, I see how you're treating me, but I know where your heart actually is, right? And so Jesus in The Chosen connects this to the destruction of the temple, because why does the temple get destroyed? Because everything that the Jewish people do over time, right? It happens because of a revolt that happens later on. But this is also connected to the mistreatment of how the Jews did everything in general, right? If the Jews would have accepted Jesus as the Messiah, if they would have seen him as the light that was here, right? Then everything would have been different. Things would have happened in a different order. The prophecies that we've had for hundreds of years would not have been there, or they would have been different prophecies, right? Because God lives outside of time. If they had accepted him in that time, then the temple wouldn't have been destroyed. The Jews wouldn't have been cold like they were. And so it's a pretty intense thing that Jesus has to worry about here. And he's thinking about the destruction of the temple. And in the destruction of the temple, he's thinking about the destruction of his father's house, right? So all of that is connected there. All of it's connected to the disobedience of the Jews during that time. It's connected to the people who just flat out, rejected Jesus. And so we're seeing the fulfillment of that there as Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, and he talks about the destruction of the temple, which we're going to hear more about the destruction of the temple, especially during the Olivet discourse, which is going to come, I think, in episode 3 of season 5. So it should be the first one that we get when we go back to theaters, which will be interesting. So we see that happen there. Then we go back to the last kind of major scene that we have here, which is Jesus going back to Phoebe's house. As he's kind of riled up and he's angry and he's sad, he walks back to Phoebe's house and he's kind of calm and collected. He takes a second, he takes off his sandals and kind of gets prepared to go into the house. We'll talk more about that kind of preparation later on in the season as we talk about washing the feet of Jesus and all that kind of stuff, washing the feet of the apostles. And as Jesus gets into the house of Phoebe, everybody is asleep. And so he goes up to the bunk of Zebedee and he wakes him up really fast. He says, Zebedee. And Zebedee wakes up. He's like, yeah, what's up? he's like super loud, which wakes up John as well. And so now John is kind of listening into the conversation. Now Jesus asks him to, in the morning, take Mother Mary and Lazarus' sisters back to Bethany. Now again, Lazarus' sisters don't have anyone to protect them, so all of these men are kind of stepping in and helping them along the way, as well as Mary, Jesus' mother, because Jesus is the one that protects her for now, right? So he asks Zebedee to take them back to Bethany, but Zebedee's like, but what about Passover? Like we're only a few days away from Passover. Shouldn't they be here? And he says, don't worry, I have a plan. And then he says that he would do it. So he's going to leave in the morning and take the women back to Bethany. I think a partial reason for this is to avoid the women being there whenever he's going to cleanse the temple, because it's going to look really weird and crazy. And he doesn't want them to be there for that. I think also he's going to ask them to stay outside the city until basically through Passover. Now we know that most of these women do not do that, so maybe they just don't listen to him. I don't know what the deal is, but we know that probably the Lazarus' sisters probably aren't there. Maybe we know that Lazarus probably isn't there. Maybe we don't have a full understanding of who is where during this time, but we do know that like Mary Salome, who is John and James' mother, she's there at the cross. We know that Mother Mary's there at the cross. We know that Mary Magdalene's there at the cross. So we have at least those 3 Marys that are there at the cross, plus other people that were around, right? We know that John is also there during that time because he's invited by our new friend Malchus, which we'll talk about in episode 2. So there's some interesting things. We'll see how that plays out, what they're kind of writing there in The Chosen. We'll see what happens there. Clearly, we're going to have Mother Mary and everybody else at the cross because that's how it happens in the scripture, but I wonder how we'll get there. Next, we see that John is kind of up and listening to this conversation that they're having. Then Zebedee goes back to sleep. as Jesus walks and he goes into the women's room and he kisses his mother as he goes over to her bunk. And then he pulls out the box at the bottom of her bunk, which is the box that holds the bridle. And so he pulls that out and he begins walking to another part of this mansion that is Phoebe's house. Then as he gets into some sort of like workshop room, he goes over there and he opens up the bridle. He pulls out the bridle and he pulls out a piece of it, which is kind of the piece, it's like a small strip of leather, basically, with a buckle on the end. And then he takes out some sort of knife and he begins to cut it into a smaller strip. And then out of nowhere, he kind of like pulls out a fully made whip, like off to the side. This was kind of weird for me because in John chapter 2, which is where we kind of get this from, there's two cleansings of the temple. Okay, there's one that's in John chapter 2, and then there's one that's later. They're kind of merging these together. Some people will say these are two separate events. Some people will say that John told this event earlier because he wanted it to explain a specific thing in the beginning of his gospel, right? But it happens during the same feast, so it's during Passover here. But we see that Jesus, making a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. So we see that here he actually makes a whip of cords. In other versions, it just says that he got a whip, or he whipped them. Like, it didn't really tell us where he got the whip from. So in John chapter 2, it tells us that he actually made the whip. So in the show, he kind of like pulls out a fully made whip, and then he just puts kind of like the tip, like the cracker on the end of the whip. It's fine. Like, it's not a big deal. It's just kind of weird. Like, I would have assumed that he would be making the entire whip, but we don't really get that. He just kind of pulls out a fully made whip and then continues on. Jesus is a craftsman, so I just assumed that he would make it fully. So yeah, I guess they did that to save time, to save money, I guess, on the shooting of it. So that makes sense. But yeah, that is kind of where the episode ends right there. He makes the whip, and then episode is over as John watches him do that, getting prepared for the next day there. And that's the end of episode 1. So as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Is there something I missed in my overview here? Remember, we're not going into too big of a detail. It's just my overview, so don't freak out too much as we miss things and all that kind of stuff. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. What would you rate it overall? I think this episode in particular, I would probably rate it maybe like a 7.5 or an 8, somewhere in there. Yeah, I'd say around that area, 7.5 or an 8. We can call it like a 7.75, something like that. Let me know your comments. Let me know your ratings below. I'd love to hear them. And of course, we'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.